Yeah, so my name's Dave Troy, and I have been engaged in the study of disinformation and social media data for about the last 15 years. I was actually the first developer to do anything on the Twitter API back in 2007. And, the Twitter founding team, I got to know them reasonably well back in around that time frame, 2007, 2008. So Jack Dorsey and Evan Williams and Biz Stone and all of those guys, we were working on some ideas for interesting features for Twitter. So a lot of the work that I was doing was around location mapping on Twitter. And so the fact that you can attach locations to tweets is, directly attributable to work that I was doing at that time. So, a little bit of notoriety with that. I had a project that was related to data visualization on Twitter and mapping that was in the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 2008. So that's kind of how I got pulled into aspects of this. And so I started looking at what kind of data was floating around online and how communities formed. And I got really interested in the idea of how networks of people form online and the way that those networks of people interact. So if you've been familiar, with a cafeteria in a high school or something like that, and you see the different tables and how people group together on those tables, that same phenomenon occurs in social media networks where there's kind of communities of interest. And that phenomenon in sociology is called homophily, the idea that like attracts like. So that turns out to be, sort of a principal insight that you need in order to analyze networks of communities that form on social media over time. And if you take that insight, you realize that you can do a lot to manipulate those communities, probably for good, probably for ill. And it was that central insight that led me into studying what was going on with Cambridge Analytica back in 2016. So if you recall, that situation was where Facebook, had been responsible for handing over a bunch of data to this firm, Cambridge Analytica, which was actually an offshoot of a firm called Strategic Communications Laboratories, which was a military psyops firm that had been deployed in service of elections around the world on behalf of mostly British interests and connected with British intelligence. But this Cambridge Analytica variant was designed to be targeted, to be used against targeting the elections in the US, as well as connected to the vote for Brexit in 2016. So, seeing that there was all of this opportunity for ill to be used with social media data and the study of networks, I kind of quickly reoriented my focus from being, gee, isn't this cool, to being more like, this seems like a real threat to democracy. So in 2016 to 2017, I started to kind of speak out about more about what was happening, not only with manipulation of networks on social media, but also disinformation, which seemed to me at the time to be pointing towards what could become a global war. So in 2017, I actually wrote a piece, several pieces. I'll just quickly screen share so you can see, one of them, which posits that there's a big war coming, basically, that this is an emerging global threat, and that the people that were behind it were Alexander Dugin, who is one of Putin's advisors and has been reported to be kind of a Putin's Rasputin kind of character. And the goal being to end NATO, destroy the EU, promote the formation of Eurasia, place the US and UK in alliance. And there's a lot of other implications with that too, including renewed aggression with Japan and a whole bunch of other global reordering. This map really sets the tone for what Dugin is envisioning. And this comes from his 1997 book, The Foundations of Geopolitics. And so basically, having identified this as a threat in 2017, I reached out to people that I know, in Congress and in government. I spoke with the late Representative Elijah Cummings and said, hey, listen, this looks really bad. It looks like we're heading into this war situation. This information war that I'm observing in real time seems to presage what could become a kinetic war. We need to get ahead of this. And obviously it was early. It was 5 years ago. So people were sort of like, okay, that sounds bad and important, but I'm not sure what to do about it right now. So Likewise, Vladislav Surkov, who had been a propagandist very deeply involved with the 2014 conflict in Ukraine, was deeply involved in setting up some of the propaganda that we were seeing in the US. And then also Steve Bannon, who had been influenced by a bunch of prominent fascist thinkers, as well as by a book called The Fourth Turning that posits a kind of cyclical view of history. And his view was and is that we are on the brink of a major conflict cycle in this sort of cyclical view of history, namely this idea of a fourth turning. So there's a lot of connections between this network and a lot of the neo-reactionary thought that has been floating around for the last several years, white supremacy, fascism. It's all kind of a piece. So basically, for me, the last 5 years have been kind of like watching a train wreck in slow motion. Something that we all saw coming, or at least I did, and many of my peers that work in this space and that I collaborate with. We've seen this coming for years, and we hoped that some of our darker fears and concerns would, perhaps go a different direction. But in fact, here we are dealing with exactly what we were concerned about in 2017. And so there's a few key principles I wanted to try to, convey and sort of lay out at the outset here, which is that first, we should understand that information war is a key part of what's going on, and that information war always precedes kinetic war. Because what information war helps to do is not so much convince people of truths or whatever. A lot of people have the idea that disinformation is designed to convince people of things that aren't true and that sort of thing. And yes, it can do that, but it's also designed to slice and dice society up into specific kinds of networks that are in opposition to each other, and the smaller the better generally. So what you have to look at isn't so much the payload of a particular disinformation campaign, but the effects that they may have on this target population. So will it help to create division? Will it help to reinforce social ties within the networks that are being spliced up or sliced up by these payloads? And so that's really kind of what you see with information war. Now, what we were starting to observe in, let's say late 2021 in particular, was that the information war was going into overdrive. We were picking up all kinds of signals that there was going to be a kinetic conflict, fairly soon. And of course, you have to combine what you find in, say, like Telegram channels with what you see on Twitter and Facebook, and also what you see in the media. And the media is a key part of what you can use to form an open source intelligence picture, but it's by far not the only thing that you can use, because frankly, a lot of reporters that aren't spending time in the trenches of kind of like what the information warfare landscape looks like really miss a lot of key signals that, if you've been paying attention to it and kind of know how to decode it, can point to what might actually happen. So around October, November of last year, I started to become very convinced that we were on the brink of a major war. And if you guys recall the run up through December and into January and whatnot, there was a lot of I think back and forth around whether or not that was really true. There were obviously people who did believe that this was a real possibility, but there was also a very pragmatic kind of belief that existed, particularly in Ukraine, that Putin was, quote, a rational actor, that he ultimately wanted power and money and was trying to angle for advantage with NATO and the EU. And my hypothesis really remained unchanged since 2017, in that I believed that he was going to, angle to pursue this Duginist agenda, which really has some very specific roots to it. So be a little bit more specific about that. So, the first thing to understand, and I'll share another article here, is that Vladimir Putin fundamentally believes that, or at least has said he believes, we'll see if, whether he really believes that or not in the end, I suppose. But let me share this window. Okay, can you, I'm not sure if it shared that right. Let me try that again.
I put Dave's article that he's referenced in the chat box, everyone.
Thanks, Kat. So this article that was published July 12th, 2021, article by Vladimir Putin on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, really is a kind of validation of Putin of the Duginist idea set. So basically what he's arguing here, and it's a slog to read this because it's historical and it's kind of crazy, but this is what's in Putin's head. And he wrote this. I mean, or at least wrote it with staff or whatever. But it is basically arguing that Russia and Ukraine are one people. That it is the Rus people, the Rus people that populate Russia. That Ukraine is in some sense, one with Russia, and that what needs to happen is that Russia and Ukraine need to be reunited. Now, this also couples with rhetoric that has been floating around from them, talking about Ukrainian Nazis. And those of you in Europe probably have more of a background with this than people in the United States who don't know this history well. But what that is kind of referring to is, in the early days of the Second World War, as Germany was doing its conquests in Europe, in Ukraine, there was a faction of folks that sympathized with the Nazis and with Hitler, who were interested both in Ukrainian nationalism as well as implementing a kind of Hitler-style regime in Ukraine and aligning with Hitler. So there was a group called the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists that fell into two factions, one led by a guy named Andrew Melnik and another led by a guy named Stepan Bandera. And the Banderite faction was extremely sympathetic to Hitler and the Nazis. And so this faction of Nazi, Ukrainian nationalists became kind of a known entity within Ukraine, and has become a kind of a information warfare punching bag for Putin to amplify this idea that there are right-wing Nazis in Ukraine. Now, the fact of the matter is that that faction, which does exist, in recent elections, has gotten something like 2.3% of the vote. Compare that to the percentage that, say, like Alternative for Deutschland has gotten in Germany, which is much higher. It's 15%, 11% or something like that. And then also look at the recent election in France, where Marine Le Pen, who is fundamentally cut from the same cloth, has gotten 40 some percent. So this notion that there's a bunch of Ukrainian Nazis that are need to be denazified is very much coming from this propaganda, and I think pretty disingenuous. And I would imagine that there are arguments that can be had with informed people over just how much of an influence that network is. But at the same time, that's the point, is that there can be an argument. And that argument is what helps to drive the division, which helps to advance Putin's agenda and enable him to continue to do the stuff that he's doing. So, that's some background on kind of like what he's thinking about. Now, Dugin is, there's been a lot of debate as to whether or not Dugin is a major influence and has been a major influence on Putin for some time. And I think in the final analysis, it will be revealed that a lot of the deflection away from the notion that Dugin has influence has been a bit of a disinformation campaign designed to allow Putin to continue to advance his agenda without the scrutiny that would come if everybody was looking at Dugin for answers. So a little bit of background, on Dugin. He's something of a, sort of a mystic philosopher. He wrote a book, as I mentioned, in 1997 called The Foundations of Geopolitics. And what he posits is, a kind of a realignment of the Eurasian sphere. So he believes that land-based empires are sort of the, I guess, more moral traditionalist kind of societies, and that the Russian landmass, which is really the main thing that Russia has going for it, except for its oil and gas reserves, is a strategic, kind of advantage, and that it lends it this kind of legitimacy as a land-based empire. So it views the Russian, sort of mainland, the heartland of Russia, as this like heartland of Eurasia, and that all of the other land around Russia is a kind of a fringe land. He also posits this idea of a tellurocracy, which he believes defines a kind of land-based, empire that stands in contrast to societies that are more connected to the sea and to trade via the sea. Now, these are ancient ideas, right? The idea that trade and mercantilism is somehow or another less ethically or spiritually pure than agriculture and existence that's tied to the land. These are very old ideas that have led to conflict in the past in societies, and it is a lever that one can use to spark a kind of deep conflict. For those of you that may be familiar with the Salem witch trials in the United States, sociologists and historians have struggled for a long time to try to make sense of just what the hell happened there, where they were burning witches at the stake. And the best explanation that I have seen comes from historians named Stephen Boyer and Nissenbaum. I forget his first name, or Paul Boyer and Stephen Nissenbaum, I think it is. But anyway, they posited that it was a social network conflict between agricultural interests who were more tied to the land and mercantile interests that were more tied to the sea and to trade. Now, if you look at the conflict with, World War II, and with, the kind of historical resentment of the Jewish population in Europe, there's, always been this idea that Jews were mobile and that they didn't really have any connection to the land, and that they were, good with money because they were constantly converting their resources into mobile, portable kind of capabilities, which leads to resentment because of money changers. I mean, this is ancient kind of rivalries and resentments that are being exploited with all of this. So, that's the level of kind of hook into society that he's going for. There's another angle that Dugin and Putin have been playing on, which is the idea that the Christian church has like three natural phases. There's like the Roman phase, and that there was the Constantinople, where the Byzantine church was established, and that ultimately there would be a third Rome, which would be Moscow. And so as Christianity moves east, etc., like this would be the destiny of both Russia, Moscow, and the churches. The other sort of prophecy that this plays on is the idea that the Roman Catholic Church would reunite with the Russian Orthodox Church, as well as the other Orthodox churches in the region. So, the Ukrainian Orthodox, the Greek Orthodox, whatever, and would create a kind of a Christian empire rooted in traditionalism that would span, really from Greece all the way to Japan, is really the vision that they have with this. So, what they're doing with the idea of traditionalism is trying to tie this land-based empire idea, this agriculture idea, to this notion of the religious revival and the traditionalism. So that's where you get all of the anti-gay legislation and anti-gay rhetoric and information warfare. That's where you get all of the concern over gender and transsexuals and all of that. It's all an effort to sort of reignite this spark around traditionalism, to try to flip the entire planet on a global scale from being sort of progressive and open-minded and whatever, to being more traditional, and to also reassert the primacy of patriarchy and the idea of men being men and being strong and all of that kind of thing, to try to bring that back more into focus. So again, another lever that's being used So the combination of, agriculture, land, patriarchy, hierarchy also is in play, where, the idea that this stands in opposition to collectivism, and that there should be a hierarchy in society with clear winners and losers. That's another big part of the ideology that's in play here. And so, if you also look at Dugan, who is not terribly original in his own right, he's drawing from a variety of other previous philosophers, including H.L. Mackinder, Ivan Ilyin, who was a Russian poet who wrote a lot of these kinds of ideas around 1917 and was, I think, jailed in 1922. Julius Evola, who was an Italian philosopher who deeply informed Mussolini's fascism, and another guy named Francis Parker Yockey, who wrote a book around 1947-48 called Imperium, which really describes this idea that science, with all of its its seeming certitude. Of course, science is obviously about asking questions. Science has created this kind of materialist progressivism that fails to offer the kind of cultural answers that people in sort of great societies look for. So the kind of greatness, the aspiration towards cultural expression, it becomes eroded by this idea of science, because it kind of science is really all about disassembling the idea of magic, right? You're taking the ideas that are transcendent and spiritual and that make societies feel greatness, and breaking them down into their component parts and asking a lot of questions about them, basically. So Yockey posits that science and sort of progressivism are in lockstep, eroding the greatness of cultures, and that ultimately culture is going to push back against this and will demand to be heard from a cultural standpoint, and will want to reassert its cultural greatness, and that there is a difference between French culture and German culture and Russian culture and American culture, and that those cultural differences are worth something, and that they should be heard, and that not only should they be heard, that there will become ultimately a great war over that division between people who feel that strongly and people who feel as though we're on the right path with science, progressivism, and materialism. So that's fundamentally kind of what we're dealing with in terms of a big picture view of this war. Now, Putin, he himself is a kind of a dictatorial strongman, and I use that word in quotations. He resembles a great deal, previous kinds of dictators who have isolated themselves from an information standpoint and who are pursuing a very singular vision that is very personal to them, and without a lot of input from others. You could compare Putin pretty usefully to, Adolf Hitler or perhaps Jim Jones. And on April 6th, I hosted a session with three different psychology experts, who, have some specific background with analyzing these kinds of leaders. And their assessment of Putin is that, he is a malignant narcissist, and that he's very likely, when cornered, to lash out in ways that are unpredictable, and that could include things that would lead to his own demise, as well as to the demise of a great many others. That could include people in Russia, that could include people in the United States or in Europe. We just don't know. But if he goes down sort of the way that Hitler went down, Hitler obviously took a lot of people with him, including a lot of young people in Berlin in 1945, but also a lot of people close to him. Ultimately, Hitler reached the conclusion in his own mind that his hypothesis about the greatness of the German people was incorrect. That the German people were not as great as he thought they were, because if they were so great, they would have won on his behalf. And so, therefore, not only would the German people lose in shame, that he should lose in shame too. So he took his own life. At least that's the history. And that became the way that he solved that problem. And I think we need to be considering what Putin might do when faced with essentially the same problem. Now, in the near term, we have some dates coming up, which are, I think, potentially important, one of which is May 9th, which is Russia's historic victory day, in which they declared victory over the Soviets in 1945, and liberating, quote unquote, Berlin, after also doing a lot of raping and other things. But anyway, May 9th looms large in Putin's mindset, and they've said explicitly that they want to finish the war by May 9th. Now, what are they doing? They're struggling to take territory in the east. They're ramping up the information war, talking about nukes nonstop, and trying, I think, to both incite fear as well as to send some messaging around what they may do. There is a lot of infighting and instability within the military leadership in Russia. There seems to be some sunlight between the Russian generals and Putin in terms of agreement on strategy. I believe one general was quoted the other day as saying, "Are we having a war or are we masturbating?" I think that conflict between the military and Putin is one that's going to come to a head fairly soon. So what I think we could expect is that on or before May 9th, they are going to be tempted to accelerate things pretty dramatically in order to either try to force a strategic shift in the current situation, or to try to push the war to some kind of conclusion. That could include lashing out of any kind. And there's a lot of, I think, cliched analysis that suggests that any use of nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction would lead to, the traditional World War III response, which of course includes mutually assured destruction. And I think that that's simplistic, because at the end of the day, if, let's say that Putin decides to use a tactical nuke on the Polish border of a supply convoy that's going, bringing supplies to Ukraine, would we respond with, full-blown mutually assured destruction? I don't think so. I think that's insane. And most of the analysis that I've read suggests that what we would more likely do is to use conventional responses to try to minimize Russia's nuclear capability, or we might use, some kind of like sized tactical nuclear response. And by tactical, what we're really talking about isn't, like little fun nuclear bombs. These are bombs that are as big or bigger than the bombs that were used in World War II at, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They're large nuclear weapons. They're just smaller than the biggest bombs that we now have. So they shouldn't be taken lightly, and the after effects of those that include fallout and radiation poisoning and everything else are horrific. And we should do everything within our power to avoid that. But the problem that we face is that our adversary, I think, is in a position where they feel like they don't have any other options. And they also are using the information battle space right now to recast this as a war between Russia and the US and NATO already, even though it's, a lot of us are like, oh, we've been really careful not to cross those lines. They are already positioning it in that way. That's what they think they're doing. So you have to evaluate it from that perspective. And from that standpoint, I personally believe, and I'm saying this in the context of a private space, that, I might not say this publicly just because it's, it's my sort of worst fear, but, it is what I believe. I believe that, the US, Europe, but it's particularly like, Ukraine, Poland, Moldova are all potential nuclear targets for Russia right now. And we can't really predict what they might do. Russia's chief propagandist, or at least media propagandist, is Margarita Simonyan, and she was saying this morning that she felt as though Russia had two options: either defeat in Ukraine or World War III, and that they were going to pick World War III. So I also kind of believe that we are not doing ourselves any favor by not referring to this current conflict as World War III. I think it is World War III. We need to recast what our idea of World War III is to not be this like crazy nuclear, mutually assured, destructive, exchange, and instead look at it as it actually is. I mean, what we're really going to be looking at is a long-term conflict between Russia, the West, and China has aligned itself pretty closely with Russia. So, I've got more I could say. There's plenty more to talk about around this. I don't want to go on forever. I want to give some opportunity for you guys to ask questions and for us to have a little bit more of an interactive discussion. The last thing I would say, just to, as a, we can talk more about this in questions, is that one of the other underlying conflicts with all this is really around money and the role of money in societies. And I don't mean the desire for more of it, although everybody's a little greedy. I'm talking about the conflict between fiat currency and gold standard and crypto. Crypto has very much entered the fray as being a kind of stand-in for gold. To understand this properly, you need to go back about 100 years to 1933 and the Depression and the responses to the New Deal. Roosevelt's response was to, sort of double down on fiat and to push away gold. Mussolini responded differently, and while they didn't exactly adopt the gold standard, they did basically privatize a lot of state-run industries and started looking towards privatization and the elimination of the state and fusion with the state, really, as a kind of response to the Depression. And then Hitler, of course, responded a little bit differently still. So those three responses to the Depression set in motion a variety of reactionary responses to that we're still dealing with now. I'm currently in the process of writing like a 7,000 word, it's going to probably be like 8,000 word piece on the history of this from 1933 to the present, that really traces the network that launched all of the grievances against the Roosevelts in the 30s, that then in turn were upset with when the gold standard really went away in 1971, who in turn formed the John Birch Society, who in turn formed the Council for National Policy, who in turn ran January 6th. And all of this, January 6th, all of that is related to these ideas about money. And, the gas and oil industry has been very much aligned with sort of libertarian and Austrian economics in wanting to kind of eliminate the role of the state and to minimize regulation and that sort of thing. And that the oil and gas industry is very much aligned with Putin. So it's impossible to talk about this war with Putin and not also talk about the entire history of 20th century economics and the reactionary response to the New Deal. So anyway, I will be quiet now and let you guys maybe throw some ideas out there or ask some questions or whatever. But thank you for your attention and hearing me out.